along racial lines. He tries to defend it, confidently calling it justice, but just minutes later, Jasmine calmly dismantles his argument, presenting undeniable evidence that turns the entire room upside down. If leaders start picking winners based on race, who gets left behind next? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. In the heart of a divided Chicago, the city hall had become a powder keg, and Mayor Brandon Johnson had just lit the fuse. Over the past 18 months, more than 70% of city contracts, worth hundreds of millions, had been funneled almost exclusively to black-owned businesses. The move, publicly framed as a historic corrective, was privately decried by residents across the racial spectrum as reverse discrimination. Dozens of white and Latino business owners, many with spotless records and long histories of community service, were stripped of municipal deals without explanation. One veteran contractor described it bluntly. It felt like we were erased overnight. Community forums turned volatile. Protests erupted not from the far right, but from once loyal working-class residents, black, white, and brown, who all now ask the same burning question: when did justice become selective? The breaking point came when an internal memo leaked to the press, revealing that some contract decisions were guided not by merit, but by racial quotas and personal affiliations with Johnson's inner circle. Washington took notice. In response to mounting outrage, the House Oversight Committee appointed a special investigator, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a razor-sharp legal mind with a national profile and zero tolerance for political theater. As her black heels echoed across the marble floor of Chicago City Hall, she was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a reckoning wrapped in silk. More than 500 residents filled the Grand Hall: teachers, veterans, small business owners, retired cops. All eyes locked on Jasmine as cameras from 9 national networks broadcast every second live. A protest chant echoed faintly from the streets outside. While inside, the tension was electric, every breath held, every chair creaking like a loaded spring. Johnson sat elevated behind his mahogany bench, flanked by his legal team, but his smile never reached his eyes. The city was watching, the nation was watching, and Jasmine Crockett had come not to perform, but to prosecute a principle. As the final echoes of protest chants faded beyond the marble columns, silence fell inside the chamber. Not the silence of peace, but of a city bracing for a storm made of truth. Standing behind the mahogany podium, Jasmine adjusted the microphone, not for volume, but for clarity. Her fingertips barely trembled. Her shoulders didn't move. What rose from her lips was not the voice of politics, but the voice of someone who had carried both silence and fury and had decided, in this moment, to speak for all those who couldn't. "Justice has no color," she said, her tone calm, deliberate, carved from stone. The phrase hung in the air, unblinking. And today, Chicago must face itself. No slogans, no shadows. It wasn't grandstanding. It was invitation. It was confrontation without cruelty. A challenge not to power, but to conscience. Somewhere in the back row, a woman let out a quiet, "Amen." Others leaned in, not because they didn't hear, but because they didn't want to miss a single word that might reshape the narrative of a fractured city. Then, with a slowness that felt both rehearsed and deeply personal, Mayor Johnson leaned back in his chair. His voice, in contrast to hers, held an edge honed not by pain, but by entitlement. "You're a black woman," he said flatly, as if reciting a biological fact that should have carried moral obligation. "I thought you'd understand. You should be standing with your people, not interrogating them." The words didn't just echo. They cut. Gasps rippled through the room like a spark racing toward gunpowder. It wasn't merely a deflection. It was a command wrapped in identity politics, a dismissal hidden behind shared melanin. It said, "Because you are black, your loyalty should be pre-assigned, your scrutiny restrained, your allegiance automatic." Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped forward, not as a rebuke, but as a reclaiming. Her eyes locked on his like steel meeting steel, and in that silence, history itself seemed to lean closer. "I don't stand with skin, I stand with principle," she said, her voice low but fierce, not shaking but sharp. I am the voice for everyone, not just the ones who look like me. The room held still, caught between shame and awakening. Her next line was not shouted, not dramatized, but it struck with seismic force. And truth doesn't ask for your shade before it knocks. That was the moment. The cameras caught it. The audience felt it. And for the first time in that long chamber of power, a city obsessed with identity was forced to confront something deeper than color, conscience. With steady hands, Jasmine reached beneath the podium and withdrew a thick manila folder, unmarked, but heavy with the weight of 120 unheard voices. She didn't wave it dramatically. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she laid it flat and opened it with quiet finality, like a judge unsealing a verdict. Inside were the overlooked letters from residents who had cried out to the mayor's office and received nothing in return, not even the dignity of acknowledgement. She began to read aloud, not for performance but for posterity. The first letter belonged to Margaret Whitlow, a single mother from South Chicago. Her rent was paid, her children were in school, but her lease was terminated under policy realignment. A week later, her unit was reallocated to a family connected to a nonprofit endorsed by the mayor's equity board. Jasmine's voice didn't waver, but her words sliced through the room. She was told there was no room, she said, holding up the typed notice. But somehow, someone else got her place with no waiting list. Faces turned in the crowd, some in shock, others in slow, resigned nods. She moved to the second letter. Carlos Mejia, 57 years old, the proud owner of Casa Mejia, a family-run taqueria in the Pilsen district, passed down from his father. For over 2 decades, he had renewed his business license without a hitch. Then one day, his renewal was simply denied. No explanation, no infraction. Jasmine read the city clerk's reply, terse and opaque. Application not aligned with current strategic priorities. 2 weeks later, the lease to his location was handed to a culturally aligned startup funded by a city-sponsored grant. Jasmine leaned into the mic, calm but piercing. He didn't lose his license. It was taken, strategically, silently, systemically. A murmur swept through the chamber, not outrage yet, but something heavier, recognition. Then Jasmine stilled. She turned a page in the folder, slower this time. There was no need to rush. The truth was about to speak for itself. But let's talk about the case you can't ignore, she said, letting her words echo as she pulled out a laminated photo and held it to the room. A smiling man in a white chef's coat stood beneath a sign that read, La Tierra Roja. Robert Gomez, she said, 12 years of spotless inspections, 12 years of employment for over 50 staff, 12 years of paying taxes, feeding families, and building this city's culture. Her voice was rising now, not in anger, but in undeniable clarity. Yet with no violations, no complaints, and no due process, his license was pulled, revoked overnight. The chamber froze. Jasmine lowered the photo, eyes fixed on Johnson. And wouldn't you know it, that same license was issued without competitive bid to another restaurateur, newly formed and, coincidentally, black. No one dared move. Her next words were slower, each one punctuated by something heavier than accusation, intention. Tell me, Mr. Mayor, she asked, voice like a scalpel pressed to skin, is that justice? Or is that just strategy with a smile? This was no longer a hearing, it was a courtroom, and everyone watching, from the balconies to the televisions at home, had just become the jury. The evidence had landed like thunder, but instead of remorse or reason, what followed from the mayor's seat was something colder, a shrug draped in historical revision. Mayor Brandon Johnson didn't blink. He didn't look shaken or cornered. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with the slow, deliberate posture of someone who had already made peace with the backlash. Someone who mistook power for righteousness. A half smile crept across his face, not born from victory, but from the comfort of belief unchallenged. His fingers tapped the desk softly as he looked out, not at Jasmine, but at the room, the cameras, the country, and then delivered his line, sharp and detached. You don't understand. What we're doing here, we're correcting history. He said it as though it were a mission statement, as though every eviction, every revoked license, every broken small business was a necessary price for redemption. His kind of redemption. It wasn't an answer. It was a doctrine. One that didn't just overlook people, it erased them. And in that moment, it became clear. The mayor wasn't defending his policy. He was defending his version of the past, one where the scales of justice had to be tipped by any means necessary, even if it meant building fairness on top of fresh injustice. Jasmine didn't move at first. She let the weight of his words hang in the air, knowing silence could be as cutting as speech. When she finally stepped forward, she didn't raise her voice. She refined it, honed it like a blade. Correcting history, she said, repeating his phrase not in mockery, but as an indictment. Her heels echoed once as she moved closer to the mayor's bench, not out of anger, but out of necessity, to close the distance between justification and truth. Says who? Correcting history or repeating its worst mistakes? By punishing those who don't share your skin? The words struck not just at Johnson, but at the entire ideology he cloaked himself in. Her eyes didn't scan the crowd. They searched it. They found the woman from earlier clutching a copy of the Constitution. They found the business owner who had been denied a hearing. They found a city full of people who had been told to sit down because their skin no longer counted as history's victim. Then Jasmine turned to the cameras, not for effect, but because she knew millions were watching, waiting to hear what would be said on their behalf. And when she spoke again, it was with a calmness that carried centuries of pain and clarity. If you believe justice should be defined by color, then you've already forgotten what that word means. There was no applause, no interruption, only stillness. But it wasn't the kind that comes from confusion. It was the kind that comes when something undeniable has just been said aloud. Jasmine Crockett wasn't arguing policy anymore. She was reminding a city and a nation that justice without principle isn't justice at all. But Jasmine hadn't come just to expose bias. She came to reveal where the money went and who was cashing in while an entire city bled equity. She reached down slowly, methodically, and lifted a binder that looked unassuming, gray, marked only with the embossed seal of the city of Chicago. But in her hands it became a torch aimed directly into the shadows of patronage. "This," she said calmly, tapping the cover with one finger, "is the financial truth of this administration. Not the press releases, not the speeches. The numbers." Her voice didn't need force, only certainty. She opened the binder to a bookmarked page and held it up to the projector. The screen behind her flashed to life, revealing the first chart. 4 companies, each having received multi-million-dollar contracts from the city over the past fiscal year. She didn't dramatize. She didn't speculate. She pointed. "This company," she said, highlighting the first with a red laser pointer, "is owned by the brother-in-law of Deputy Director Malik Raines. The second, its CFO, is the mayor's former campaign treasurer. The third, managed by a shell firm whose only registered board member is Johnson's cousin. And the fourth, well, its founder shares a home address with a member of the mayor's diversity commission." A hush fell over the room. Not the confused kind, but the calculating kind. The kind that signaled the audience was already connecting dots faster than she could name them. Jasmine waited just a second longer, then continued. "These aren't accusations," she said, her tone firm, unwavering. "They are line items." The screen flipped again, this time displaying a 2-column table. On one side, all contracts awarded over the last 14 months. On the other, the racial or ethnic identification of the primary vendor. And across the entire list, not a single white-owned or Latino-owned business appeared. Jasmine didn't have to explain the math. It screamed for itself. "This isn't just exclusion," she said, each word falling like a hammer. "It's engineered erasure." People didn't gasp. They leaned in. Some scribbled notes furiously. Others sat stunned, backs pressed against stiff wooden benches, lips parted not in disbelief, but recognition. Jasmine gave the room a beat to process. Then she turned to face the mayor without hesitation. Her voice stayed level, never shouting, never flinching. "Equity," she said, "doesn't mean shifting favoritism. It means removing favoritism." She let that hang before finishing. If justice has a budget, it better have a conscience. It began with one person clapping. A woman near the back, her hair in a tight bun, her face lined with years of labor and civic duty. One slow clap, then another from a middle-aged teacher in the second row, then another from a city sanitation worker who hadn't spoken since entering the room. Applause spread not like wildfire, but like floodwater, steady, certain, and impossible to contain. This wasn't political cheering. It wasn't tribal affirmation. It was the sound of truth being acknowledged by people who had waited too long to hear it spoken with such clarity inside the very building that had ignored them. Jasmine didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a reckoning. She looked around the chamber, her gaze not one of triumph, but of accountability. She knew that applause could disappear tomorrow, that headlines fade. But for this one moment, the people had heard what their instincts had been telling them for over a year. Something was deeply, deliberately broken, and someone in power was finally saying it, out loud, on record, under lights too bright to hide behind. From the balcony, a Vietnam veteran in a worn leather jacket stood up slowly, holding his cap in one hand, his eyes glassy. A union organizer whispered to the woman next to her, "She just said what we've all been thinking." On the mayor's side of the room, however, silence hardened. His aides stopped taking notes. His legal counsel shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Johnson himself stared forward, jaw tight, his fingers now laced together, no longer in control of the room and clearly aware of it. Jasmine, meanwhile, returned her focus to the data. She flipped to one final slide, a color-coded map of Chicago, section by ward, highlighting how contracts had been geographically distributed. Entire zones, majority white and Latino, showed zero municipal investment under the current administration. It was a visual indictment, a pattern too precise to be accidental. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The map said everything. Still, she closed the moment with words that would soon echo beyond that chamber, broadcast to millions across the country. This isn't a game of balance sheets and diversity quotas. This is people's lives, their homes, their livelihoods. This is a city where fairness has been twisted into favoritism and called progress. I won't let that stand. Her voice remained even, but it carried a thunder not born from volume, but from moral weight. And as the applause returned, this time deeper, fuller, more certain, Jasmine Crockett didn't bow. She simply stood there, binder still open, the facts still glowing behind her. She had brought numbers, yes. But more than that, she had brought accountability into a room that had mistaken silence for acceptance for far too long. The numbers had landed like hammer blows. The applause was still echoing. And that's when the mayor tried to do what power always does when cornered. Make it personal. Johnson sat forward, but it wasn't confidence that straightened his spine. It was instinct. The instinct of a man who knew he was losing the room and needed something, anything, to pull the audience back to his side. He leaned into the microphone, his tone slower now, each syllable measured, but tinged with something raw, almost wounded. "You didn't grow up here," he said, eyes narrowing not with anger but calculation. "You don't understand the pain we carry." For a moment, the room held its breath, not out of awe, but confusion. The man who had just been cornered with documents, data, and financial proof wasn't offering rebuttal. He was offering identity, as if birthplace were a shield, as if pain could be hoarded. His words weren't defensive, they were possessive. He was invoking the scars of a city as a wall, a gatekeeper of legitimacy. And beneath the surface, the message was clear. You're not from here. You don't get to judge. It was the kind of argument meant to stick to the gut, not the brain. And for some in the room, it did. A few heads nodded slowly, as if swayed by the sentiment. A man in the back, clearly weary from decades of racial struggle, folded his arms as if to say, "He's not wrong." But others weren't so sure. They had heard Jasmine speak. They had seen the evidence, felt the clarity, and now this pivot into emotional ownership, felt hollow, felt rehearsed, and yet it hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, because there was no denying that Chicago had bled, that its neighborhoods had burned, that wounds weren't metaphorical, They were geographic. And Johnson was betting that Jasmine didn't have enough skin in that fire to matter. But Jasmine had heard this before. Not just here, but across the country, in every room where the truth made people uncomfortable. She had heard the accusation that she was too polished, too distant, too articulate to belong to real struggle. And yet here she stood, shoulders squared, voice unwavering, not to posture, but to protect. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't flinch. She waited. Then when the silence was just long enough for his words to sink into the minds of those watching at home, she stepped forward once more. Her voice was low but ironclad. "I'm not here to trade pain stories," she said, and the tone alone silenced whatever murmur remained. "I'm not here to catalog suffering like it's currency." Her eyes didn't dart. They locked straight ahead, on him, on the city council, on the cameras, and on the people beyond them all. "I'm here to protect the right of every Chicagoan to be treated fairly, without having to apologize for the color of their skin." The words struck like a sudden change in weather. The mayor's expression didn't break, but his hands tightened slightly, his jaw set firmer. There was nothing left to say, and he knew it. Jasmine hadn't dismissed Chicago's pain. She had expanded it. She hadn't rejected its wounds. She had demanded they stop being used to justify fresh ones. And in doing so, she didn't just diffuse the mayor's tactic. She rewrote the terrain of the debate. This wasn't about who had suffered most. This was about who was being forgotten now, today under the guise of correcting the past. The impact rippled outward. A young Latina sitting near the center clutched her notebook tighter, nodding slowly. A middle-aged white construction worker looked at Jasmine as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a Democrat, not as a congresswoman, not even as a black woman, but as a voice that was finally saying his fears out loud without shame. This was no longer a confrontation between a mayor and a federal official. This had become a reckoning between truth and tribalism. And still, Jasmine stood firm. No theatrics, no flourish. Just a stillness forged in clarity. What she said next wasn't written in any speech. It wasn't planned. It rose from a place so deep, so unflinching, that even the cameras seemed to zoom closer on their own. "You say I don't understand," she said, quieter now, but somehow more deafening than anything that had come before. "But I understand all too well what happens when power pretends that justice belongs to one side of the street. I understand what it means when people are told they must suffer in silence because their skin doesn't match the narrative. And I understand exactly what it means when a mayor, elected to serve all, starts serving only some." There was no applause. No one dared break the moment. Even the city council members, usually glued to their phones or shuffling paper, were locked in place. Because what Jasmine had just done wasn't rhetorical. It was moral. It was constitutional. It was a reminder that public service isn't inherited through struggle. It's earned through fairness. That pain may build perspective, but it doesn't grant a license to perpetuate harm. She stood there. No armor but her words, no shield but her truth. And in that room, in that silence, Jasmine Crockett made something impossible to ignore. Justice is not territorial. It's not owned by one neighborhood, one race, one memory. It is either shared or it ceases to exist at all. And as the weight of her final sentence settled, even those who disagreed with her couldn't look away. Not because she had won the argument, but because she had just made it impossible to keep pretending the debate was even fair to begin with. And just when the room thought the storm had passed, after the facts, the conflict, the clash of personal histories, Jasmine turned slowly to face the screen behind her. Because the most powerful argument she had left wasn't words, it was numbers. And numbers, when sharpened by truth, don't just speak, they indict. She gave the signal. The lights dimmed just slightly, enough for the chamber to sink into a hushed darkness, the kind usually reserved for courtroom verdicts. Behind her, the projector screen glowed to life. No theatrics, no music. Just data, cold, raw, and exact. A massive bar chart appeared, glowing red and gold against a black background. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This is the labor data," she said, her tone crisp, restrained but heavy with consequence. "Collected from the city's own filings. Verified, unrevised." The tallest bar pulsed on screen. 34%, the number stamped beside it like a wound. This is the increase in unemployment among white and Latino workers in Chicago over the past 12 months, she said. The words didn't echo. They sank slow and deep into the chest of every viewer. She stepped aside, letting the room see it in full. The silence was no longer polite. It was staggered. Then came the second slide. Jasmine pressed a button and up came a spreadsheet. Columns and rows in grayscale, except for the verdict stamped in red across entry after entry. Rejected. Beneath each denial was a note, and every note said the same thing in one form or another. Not aligned with current racial equity directive. She didn't shout. She read. These aren't rejections based on credit, or zoning, or business plans. These are denials based on what these applicants weren't born with. The room shifted. No longer curiosity, now tension. People leaned forward. A few gasps slipped out. Jasmine held up a printed letter, one she'd highlighted. It came from the Department of Community Development. She read it aloud, word for word. We regret to inform you that your profile does not meet the priority demographic of the program. She paused, folded the paper carefully, almost ceremonially, and set it on the podium. This isn't economic development, she said. It's economic exclusion with a smile. She moved slowly now, not because she was tired, but because every step mattered. With the chamber utterly still, Jasmine turned to the screen once more. This time the image was simple, a single horizontal line. Above it, the word eligible. Below it, not eligible. Then came the data overlay, dots representing actual applicants, clustered heavily below the line. Nearly every one of those rejected fell into two groups, white and Latino. These are your neighbors, she said, letting the weight of that fact settle. Your teachers, your mechanics, your grocers. They weren't turned away because they didn't try. They were turned away because someone decided they no longer counted. She said it plainly, without venom, and somehow that made it hurt more. Then came the pivot, the moment her voice didn't rise in volume, but in power. She stepped forward again, placed both hands on the podium, and looked straight into the crowd, then into the cameras, then into the country. Justice isn't switching who suffers. It's erasing the lines that tell us who's allowed to succeed. Her words were slow but not soft, sharp but not cruel. They rang out like the final sentence of a closing argument in a case that no longer needed a jury, only a conscience. No one applauded. Not yet. The room was frozen, not from fear, but from recognition. It was as if every person in that chamber had been holding an invisible scale, and in that moment, they realized they'd been balancing it on myth. Behind Jasmine, the screen faded to black, but what she had shown couldn't be turned off. It would linger in inboxes, on social media feeds, in late-night conversations at dinner tables across Chicago. In that silence, Jasmine Crockett didn't just present evidence. She forced the city to look in the mirror and then asked, "Are you willing to call this justice, or just a new name for the same old sin?" The charts had exposed disparity. The testimonies had revealed neglect. But Jasmine knew the most damning truths weren't in what had been done. They were hidden in what had been written. And now, it was time for the city to read it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The silence in the chamber had already turned electric, tense, volatile, ready to ignite. Jasmine reached into her binder, pulled out a single page, and held it carefully between her fingers, like someone handling a live wire. It wasn't a policy memo. It wasn't a budget line item. This was something far more raw, a message never meant to see daylight. "What I'm about to read is not a headline," she said, her tone low but unwavering. "It's not a tweet. It's not campaign rhetoric. It's a private, internal email from Mayor Johnson to his senior staff." There was no need to dramatize it. The room already knew that whatever was on that page wasn't good, because no one in power gives warnings before reading something that is. Jasmine held it up for all to see. The heading was plain, typed in bold sans serif, confidential, internal communication. Beneath it, no redactions, no blacked out sections, just one paragraph that carried the weight of 1,000 decisions. She looked straight at the mayor, who was now motionless in his chair. Then turning back to the room, she read it aloud. It's time black people control the city's purse, the way they used to control us. It landed with the force of a confession, the kind that doesn't come from a moment of remorse, but from a leak. The room didn't gasp. It hardened. The air turned thick. No one moved. For a long, crushing second, it was as if every breath had been stolen from the room. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the sentence hang, suspended in the stale air of a room that could no longer claim ignorance. The words weren't metaphor. They weren't out of context. They were intent. Naked, bitter, unfiltered intent. The meaning was clear. This wasn't about equity. This was about retribution, about weaponizing history, not healing it. It was policy conceived not in compassion, but in resentment. And the cost of that resentment was now written in unemployment, in revoked licenses, in evicted mothers and shuttered storefronts. Jasmine didn't look around for validation. She didn't wait for applause. Instead, she folded the page slowly, carefully, the way someone might close the lid on something toxic. Her hands moved deliberately, not as a performer, but as a prosecutor. Then she looked back up, her eyes sweeping the room, not defiantly, not emotionally, but with the quiet power of someone who's already won. This is hatred, not policy. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. But it carried the gravity of a closing argument that no one could unhear. It wasn't a zinger. It wasn't for sound bites. It was a declaration. And it struck deeper than any outburst ever could. Across the room, you could feel the shift. Some of the mayor's aides, who had been scribbling notes or whispering moments ago, now sat frozen, their pens still, their eyes locked on the floor. A man in the third row, business suit, graying hair, folded arms, breathed out through his nose like someone who had just had a long-held suspicion confirmed. A younger woman, maybe early 20s, black college student from the South Side, nodded slowly, not in agreement with the sentiment, but in recognition of a line that had finally been crossed. And Johnson? He didn't say a word. His face was still, unreadable, but his shoulders had dropped ever so slightly. The room had turned, not on race, not on politics, on truth. Because what Jasmine had just shown them wasn't a difference of opinion. It was a revelation of mindset. It was the mask peeled away. And behind it was the reason so many residents, black, white, Latin, Asian, had felt abandoned. Not because justice had come too late, but because it had come twisted. Still, Jasmine didn't move from the podium. She placed the folded email flat on the wood before her, as if filing it into evidence. Because that's what it was now. Exhibit A in the trial of trust versus betrayal. She didn't call for resignation. She didn't grandstand. Her restraint was more damning than outrage ever could be, because what she had just revealed needed no embellishment. It didn't need to be shouted. It was simply the truth, and the truth spoken plainly had become the sharpest weapon in the room. There were no objections, no rebuttals, just the hum of quiet reckoning, the rustling of paper, the shifting of moral ground beneath every chair in the room. Some looked down, others looked straight ahead, but no one looked away, because Jasmine Crockett had just proved what they all feared. This wasn't about justice. It was about power in new hands, but the same old fist. Jasmine's final words had barely faded when a rustle broke the silence. Not from the gallery, not from the mayor's bench, but from within the inner circle itself. It began with the sound of a chair sliding against marble, so small it might have gone unnoticed on any other day. But in this moment, this fragile, breathless moment, it was the sound of a fault line cracking. Heads turned, eyes locked in. A man was rising, not from the crowd, but from within the mayor's own front row. He stood slowly, deliberately, as though every inch he rose carried a moral cost. His name was Marcus Hale, a senior advisor, and one of the longest-serving members of Brandon Johnson's inner circle. His resume was as heavy as his conscience now felt. A former civil rights attorney, architect of several city equity initiatives, and, until this hour, one of the most visible defenders of the mayor's race-forward policies. Marcus didn't raise his hands. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't need to. The entire room had turned toward him, as if guided by some unseen instinct. The mayor froze. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in the sudden recognition that something was unraveling from the inside out. Hale didn't look at him. Not yet. His eyes moved across the gallery, scanning the faces of a city divided. Contractors, teachers, single mothers, students, all watching him with the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals or courtroom verdicts. Then Marcus Hale spoke. "I used to think I was helping black people," he began, his voice steady, not loud, but clear enough to carry across the chamber. The statement hit like a dropped pin in a cathedral, not from anger, from honesty. Raw, undiluted honesty. His jaw was tight, his lips dry, but his voice didn't shake. He wasn't a man confessing under pressure. He was reclaiming his reflection, piece by painful piece. But now I see I've been helping to divide us. No one breathed. No one interrupted. It was the kind of line that didn't ask for a reaction. It created one. People looked to one another, unsure whether they were witnessing an act of betrayal or an act of courage. Jasmine didn't move, but she watched with the quiet intensity of someone who knew exactly how much this moment cost. Marcus continued, one step forward now, his gaze unwavering. "I've defended every policy," he said, "every choice. I thought it was justice, but it was something else." There was no tremble in his voice, but there was weight. Years of political loyalty colliding with 1 hour of truth. He looked toward the mayor now directly for the first time since standing. "We didn't build bridges, we built borders." That line didn't just echo, it shifted the room. You could feel it, like a drop in temperature, like the sudden clarity that comes after months of denial. Staffers who once took notes now stared at the floor. One woman wiped her eye, not in sadness, but in recognition. Something sacred had been cracked wide open. And then came the final blow, not a shout, not a performance, but a decision. "I can't be a part of this anymore." Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and removed a folded piece of paper. It wasn't long. It wasn't ornate. It was a single paragraph, typed, signed, dated. He walked to the edge of the dais where a city clerk sat, stunned. "Effective immediately," he said. "I resign." He placed the letter down, turned and faced the cameras. His image, tired, resolute, stripped of illusion, was already being broadcast into thousands of living rooms across the city. It wasn't just a resignation, it was an indictment from within. In that moment, Marcus Hale wasn't just a political figure stepping away. He was the embodiment of a question that had haunted the city since the start of this administration. If justice tilts in any direction, is it still justice? And for once, someone inside the walls of power had answered. As he stepped away from the front row, he passed behind Jasmine. Their eyes met only for a heartbeat. She gave no reaction, no nod, no smile. She didn't have to. The weight of his choice carried its own echo. The chamber didn't erupt. It didn't applaud. It did what people do when the truth no longer leaves room for noise. It sat in silence, stunned by clarity. And through that silence, the image of Marcus Hale, walking out of City Hall under the glare of the lights and the burden of his conscience, would stay etched in the city's memory for a very long time. As Marcus Hale stepped out of the chamber, leaving behind not just his position, but the administration he once helped shape, Jasmine Crockett turned back to the microphone, not to continue the hearing, but to finish what she came to do. The silence in the chamber wasn't empty. It was loaded, dense with revelation, grief, reckoning. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, motionless for a moment longer, absorbing everything the room had endured. She wasn't performing. She wasn't reacting. She was holding space for every displaced worker, every denied application, every small business shuttered, and every citizen who had sat quietly for too long, wondering if anyone in power even remembered their name. Her fingers curled once against the edges of the wood, and then she lifted her eyes, not toward her allies, not toward the cameras, but toward the people. The entire room leaned forward in anticipation, sensing what was coming. Not a conclusion, but a verdict. Her voice, when it came, didn't tremble. It carried not the fury of a politician, but the steadiness of a judge. "Power is not a weapon for revenge," she said, and though she spoke softly, her words cut through the still air like a bell in winter. "It's a chance to rebuild trust." It wasn't a soundbite, it wasn't for applause, it was surgery. And in the pause that followed, you could hear the breathlessness of people finally hearing the truth put into words they didn't even know they needed. Jasmine didn't look down. She didn't break eye contact with the crowd. The room didn't belong to the mayor anymore. It didn't belong to political factions or city departments. At that moment, it belonged to her, and more importantly, to the truth. "And if you don't understand that," she said, her tone tightening, "you don't deserve to hold it." The effect was instant, not explosive, not chaotic. It was profound. The chamber seemed to freeze around that sentence. It wasn't just a rebuke. It was a moral disqualification, a declaration that the very seat of leadership demanded something more than ideology. It demanded humility, wisdom, the courage not to retaliate, but to restore. She didn't follow it up. She didn't speak again. She let the words do what they were always meant to do, resonate. And then the silence broke. Not from above, not from the officials on the dais, but from the people, from the rows of folding chairs, from the corners of the gallery. It started with a single person, an older black woman in a denim jacket, her eyes wet with quiet emotion. She stood slowly, as if standing were a statement in itself. She began clapping, once, twice, then with certainty. Across the aisle, a white firefighter followed, rising with arms crossed, nodding as he joined in. A young Latina mother stood next, baby in one arm, palm to heart with the other. Then a teacher, then a clerk, then a veteran. In moments, the entire room was on its feet, not in frenzied applause, but in something deeper. Unified acknowledgement. They weren't cheering Jasmine. They were responding to truth. Truth spoken without venom. Truth spoken without manipulation. Just truth. Standing on its own 2 feet and daring anyone to challenge it. Jasmine didn't move. She remained at the podium, framed in light, the chamber vibrating with applause that wasn't partisan. It was human. Behind her, the seal of the city of Chicago loomed large on the wall. It had seen corruption. It had seen betrayal. But today it saw something else. Accountability without performance. Leadership without arrogance. Conviction without division. And still she didn't move. She didn't soak in the moment, didn't nod, didn't raise a fist or a smile. Because she knew, applause fades, headlines pass. But moments like this, they etched themselves into civic memory. The cameras rolled. The clips would be shared by millions. But the real impact wasn't online. It was in that room, in the shared glances between strangers who realized they weren't alone in their frustration, in the tears of people who had thought they were forgotten by a city that kept telling them they didn't qualify, in the quiet realization that justice had finally been spoken without filter and without fear. She stepped back from the microphone at last, not to leave, but to make space for what she had just said to breathe. The ovation continued, not frantically, not mechanically, but rhythmically, steadily. Black hands, white hands, brown hands, clapping for the same thing at the same time. And in that rarest of political moments, Jasmine Crockett didn't just deliver a closing statement, she reset the moral center of the room. As the applause finally softened and Jasmine stepped back into shadow, the echo of her words still hanging in the chamber, the weight shifted from revelation to consequence. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take the day. The murmurs inside City Hall turned to motion within minutes. The aldermen, visibly shaken, some still standing from the ovation, began exchanging terse glances. What had just unfolded wasn't a political disagreement. It was a collapse of confidence laid bare in front of cameras, constituents, and conscience. Behind the dais, the chairman of the Oversight Committee reached for his microphone, not with the usual rehearsed composure, but with urgency. "This council," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an oath not yet fulfilled, "will vote immediately to initiate an independent investigation into the policies and procurement practices of this administration." No one spoke against it, not even Johnson's closest allies. Because in the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's takedown, defending the mayor had gone from risky to radioactive. The resolution passed by a margin not seen in years. Unanimous. 29 votes. No abstentions. No procedural delay. The language was clear, precise, and damning. A full audit. Subpoena power. Testimony under oath. Independent legal counsel with no ties to the mayor's office. The city clerk read it aloud, but by the time she reached the final clause, no one was listening to her voice. They were already hearing what it meant. For the first time, City Hall wasn't just reacting, it was rebuking. And the mayor, once the loudest voice in the room, sat in stunned silence, his jaw tight, his hands unmoving. He didn't raise an objection. He didn't stand to fight. Because how do you argue with numbers, with documents, with betrayal from your own inner circle? The cameras panned as the vote was finalized. Jasmine remained seated. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. The battle was never about her. It was about pulling a truth into the light that had long been buried beneath slogans and selective compassion. Across the chamber, members of the public, those who had waited years for someone to name what they were living through, let out a quiet, collective exhale. Not celebration, relief. A chance, however narrow, that their stories would no longer die in silence, that finally the system would be forced to interrogate itself. Behind closed doors, aides scrambled. Legal teams whispered in hallways. The mayor's press secretary was already drafting a statement before she left her seat. But they all knew the city was no longer spinning his narrative. It was writing its own. By evening, the order was signed. By morning, it was front-page news across every major outlet in Chicago. But long before headlines could catch up, the message had already been etched into the wood and marble of the chamber itself. Power had overstepped, and now for once it would be held to account. The resolution had passed, the chamber had emptied, but the real verdict wasn't just in votes or headlines, it was in what happened next, in the movement Jasmine Crockett unknowingly set in motion. It didn't begin with a press conference or a protest. It began with a whisper, then a choice, then another, and another. In the quiet hours after Jasmine Crockett's departure from Chicago, something unshakable began to crystallize in the minds of thousands. It wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was resolve. Resolve to reclaim the language of justice from those who had bent it. Resolve to demand fairness, not filtered through skin tone or legacy wounds, but through equal eyes. That evening, a group of volunteers, Black, White, Latin, gathered in a South Side community center and painted the words in broad red letters across butcher paper. Justice without color. By morning, it was hanging from overpasses and city fences. By nightfall, it had become the most searched phrase in Illinois. The media didn't know how to frame it. Was it a backlash? A civil rights evolution? A betrayal of progressivism or its truest form? They debated, shouted, opined. But outside of studios, something clearer was happening. Regular people, nurses, janitors, veterans, college kids, began holding forums. Not to air grievances, but to ask hard questions. Why had fairness become a quota? Why did fighting injustice now mean endorsing exclusion? Why were some voices considered valid only because of ancestry, and others ignored because of it? These weren't the words of right-wing revolt. They were the words of people who had voted for compassion and ended up watching it weaponized. And in every conversation, one name kept surfacing, not as a savior, but as the spark: Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine didn't speak publicly. She refused interviews. She declined invitations to join new movements or headline national broadcasts. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was principle. The hearing had never been about her. It had been about truth. And now that it had been spoken, she trusted the people to carry it forward. She flew home quietly. No entourage. No triumphant statements. Just her in a worn leather briefcase full of case notes, a stack of letters from constituents, and a silence heavy with what she had left behind. As her flight cut through the clouds, she looked out at the skyline of Chicago disappearing beneath her, not with satisfaction, but with the calm of someone who had finished what needed to be said. But America wasn't finished with her. 3 days later, Time magazine went to print with a black background and a white serif headline. Her face, lit only by the shadows of the hearing room, filled the center of the cover. No political label, no partisan identity. Just a single quote etched into the national consciousness. I don't represent a skin tone. I represent justice. That sentence did more than trend. It detonated. College students began citing it in essays. Local leaders recited it in city councils. Protesters wrote it on cardboard, but so did public defenders on court briefs. In a time when America was drowning in tribalism, one woman had managed to stand in the fire and say what no one else dared. Justice belongs to everyone, or it isn't justice at all. It wasn't just a quote, it was a compass, and millions began adjusting theirs. In Chicago, the aftershocks were immediate. A growing number of citizens aligned under the banner of justice without color, not as a political party, but as a civil ethic, a standard. They weren't asking the city to ignore race. They were asking it to stop using race as a substitute for merit, for evidence, for truth. Public contracts were re-examined. A coalition of civil rights attorneys demanded a review of past business rejections under the Equity Initiative. Even progressive aldermen, once strong defenders of Johnson's race-first framework, found themselves walking back statements. The moment wasn't partisan, it was moral. And still, Jasmine remained out of the spotlight. She issued no statements, no book deals, no morning show appearances. But her absence became its own statement. It said, "This isn't about me, it's about what we do next." That kind of restraint in modern politics didn't just earn respect, it commanded faith. Weeks turned into months, and justice without color chapters began popping up across the country. Minneapolis, Philadelphia, St. Louis. At first, they were just reading groups, local meetings. Then came city petitions, policy proposals, legal challenges. Their creed was clear. No public benefit should be assigned or denied on the basis of skin color. Period. They didn't ignore racism. They refused to replicate it in reverse. Their fight wasn't against any one race. It was against weaponized identity masquerading as reform. Back in Washington, members of Congress began quietly reaching out to Jasmine, not to exploit the momentum, but to understand it. What had she tapped into? What had she uncovered? Her answer, relayed through aides, was always the same. People want to be seen as whole, not as demographic slices, not as cultural liabilities, not as historical balances, but as citizens, equal under the law, equal in opportunity, equal in dignity. And then came the moment that sealed her place, not in history books, but in the hearts of those who had long given up on them. A small boy in Milwaukee, just 10 years old, biracial, standing in front of a microphone in a school gymnasium, quoted her line as his speech opening for student council elections. "I don't represent a skin tone. I represent justice." The room, filled with teachers and classmates, went silent, then a standing ovation. And just like that, Jasmine's fight was no longer about hearings or headlines. It had become a promise carried by the next generation, one not born into bitterness, but one determined never to inherit it. The crowds had gone home, the signs taken down, and Jasmine's words had been etched into history. But when the echoes faded, what remained was what mattered most: the lesson. It was never about the hearing. Not really. Not about the headline or the vote. Not even about the mayor. What Jasmine Crockett stood for, and what she walked through, was bigger than one confrontation in one chamber. It was about a dangerous idea that had quietly taken root in cities across America, that the way to fix a broken system was not to repair it for all, but to tilt it in a different direction, to redistribute injustice rather than eliminate it, to reassign pain instead of uprooting it. Jasmine had seen it creeping in through policy, through language disguised as healing. She saw how quickly justice could be rebranded as reparative while still leaving new victims in its wake. Quiet ones, invisible ones, unqualified for empathy because of the color of their skin. And she stood in the middle of that storm and said no. The lesson then wasn't in her victory. It was in her refusal to stay silent. It was in her decision to risk everything, to be called a traitor to her own community, to be misquoted, maligned, and misunderstood, just to defend a principle older than politics, equality without conditions. She knew that true justice doesn't ask where you were born or what your ancestors endured. It asks who is hurting now, who is being left out now. She didn't reject the history of injustice. She honored it by refusing to let it justify new forms of exclusion. And in doing so, she reminded us that the goal was never to turn the tables. It was to burn the table and build something where no one's seat is conditional. Jasmine's stand brought something into sharp focus: how easy it is to become the very thing you once fought. The machinery of identity politics had promised healing, but in too many corners it had become a new system of gatekeeping, where access was measured not by merit, but by demographic alignment, where empathy had prerequisites, where some were told it's not your turn to speak, no matter how much truth they carried. She challenged that, not with outrage but with evidence, not with slogans but with silence that forced reflection. She stood against the seduction of righteous revenge and said, "No, we do better, or we become them." And in doing so, she paid a price. The backlash wasn't quiet. It came from all sides. Critics said she was undermining racial progress. Others accused her of pandering to white grievance. Her inbox flooded, her alliances strained. But still, she stood. Because Jasmine understood something we all forget when history gets loud. Justice is not a favor you extend to the worthy. It is a promise you make to the undeserving. And when we start deciding who deserves fairness based on skin color, we are not undoing racism, we are redesigning it. That was the human lesson. Not just political, not academic, human. That standing up for everyone doesn't mean standing against anyone. That rejecting discrimination in all its forms is not betrayal, it's integrity. That refusing to weaponize pain doesn't mean you're denying it. It means you're transcending it. Jasmine showed us that we don't move forward by flipping the hierarchy. We move forward by removing it entirely. Her words that day weren't poetic, they were surgical. They carved through the false comfort of tribal thinking and left behind something rare in American politics: a clear moral path. And that path is not easy. It demands that we listen before we defend, that we protect even those who look like our former enemies, that we hold our own side to the same standard we demand from others. Jasmine did that. She looked power in the eye, not white power, not black power, but the power that hides behind virtue, and she said, "You've gone too far. You've forgotten what this was supposed to be about." The truth is, she didn't just remind a city how to be fair, she reminded it how to be brave. Brave enough to say no to easy narratives, brave enough to ask harder questions, brave enough to see justice not as a political trophy, but as a fragile trust we rebuild each time we defend the rights of someone we might never meet. That's what this was about. Not a courtroom drama, not a clash between parties, but a test of whether we, as a society, still remember how to choose principle over position, truth over tribe, unity over resentment. Jasmine Crockett passed that test. She walked into a hearing surrounded by assumptions and walked out having shattered all of them. And the most profound part, she didn't win because she was louder. She won because she was clearer, because she refused to bend the truth to fit the times, because she understood that progress measured in one direction is not progress at all. It is postponed harm. And if we don't unlearn that cycle, it will eat every generation that comes after. So when the dust settles, what do we take with us? This: that the most revolutionary thing you can do is protect the person you are told doesn't matter. That justice without favoritism is not neutrality. It is radical moral courage. And that the next time power comes wrapped in empathy, but demands silence from those who see injustice. We'll remember Jasmine Crockett. We'll remember what she said. And more importantly, we'll remember what she stood for. But the story doesn't end with applause, a magazine cover, or even a moral lesson. Because a mirror held up to injustice is only powerful if we dare to act on what we see. This is not a moment for admiration, it's a moment for action. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak so we could feel inspired for a day. She spoke so we'd finally stop waiting for someone else to stand. What happened in that hearing room wasn't just a reckoning for one man or one city. It was a line drawn in moral concrete, daring all of us to choose which side we're on. Because the truth is, justice doesn't enforce itself. And silence, especially the kind dressed up as sophistication or neutrality, is what injustice relies on most. Jasmine didn't face down a political machine, endure personal attacks, and shatter expectations so we could sit back and admire her courage. She did it so we would remember that justice is not a moment. It is a movement, and movements only live if we move. So move. Start in your community, in your workplace, in your city hall. Ask the questions no one wants asked. Are we making people more equal or just more divided? Are we handing out opportunities fairly or just rotating the winners? Show up at school board meetings and ask if equity means everyone or just those who check the right boxes. Push your leaders to justify not just their results, but their methods. And when you hear someone weaponize identity to avoid accountability, don't shrink. Don't nod. Don't smile politely. Say what Jasmine said without flinching. If you don't understand that power is meant to build trust, not trade in retribution, then you don't deserve to hold it. This is not about being popular. It's about being principled. You will lose friends. You will be misunderstood. You may be called things Jasmine was called, a traitor, a divider, a sellout. But if you are standing up for fairness that applies to everyone, then you are standing in the right place. The people who tell you to wait, to be quiet, to read the room, they are the ones who fear what happens when truth is spoken clearly. Jasmine didn't ask for permission to speak. She didn't negotiate with injustice. She stood in its path and held it accountable, not because she wanted to go viral, but because she couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent. And that is the ask. Not perfection, not applause. Just refusal. Refusal to accept that justice belongs to one group at a time. Refusal to call exclusion progress just because it wears a friendlier face. Refusal to be complicit in the comfortable lie that you have to pick a side between race and principle. You don't. Jasmine proved it. Now prove it where you are. Speak when it's inconvenient. Step in when it's easier to step aside. Write, march, vote. Refuse to play by the new rules of silence. Refuse to let fairness be rebranded into favoritism. This isn't about politics, it's about conscience. We don't need another Jasmine. We need 1,000,000 people who understand what she understood. That justice doesn't care about your skin, your tribe, your Twitter handle. It cares about what you do when someone else is treated unfairly. And it's not your turn to be angry. So make it your turn. Make it your business. Because that's how this spreads. That's how it wins. Not with hashtags, with people. People like you, not tomorrow. Now thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a nationally televised congressional hearing watched by millions, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General accused of erasing hundreds of police abuse records from public view. Bondi defended herself with polished speeches and political pride, insisting the system was clean. But just minutes later, Jasmine flipped the entire narrative, presenting undeniable evidence that shattered the illusion. What consequences will Pam Bondi face when the truth can no longer be buried? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The red live icon pulsed on 12 million screens across America. Inside the studio, tension clung to the air like static. Under rows of clinical white lights, 2 chairs, one black, one red, stood divided by a narrow table that looked more like a front line than furniture. The camera zoomed in as Larry McAllister, the silver-haired titan of American journalism, leaned into the mic. "Good evening, America," he said with courtroom gravity. "Tonight is not a debate, it's an examination." The lights shifted, locking onto 2 women seated face to face. Neither blinked. Neither smiled. The audience didn't breathe. Even behind the cameras, no one moved. This wasn't theater anymore. This was the start of something irreversible. To Larry's right sat Pam Bondi, Flawlessly styled, sharp-shouldered, the Florida Bulldog who had once stood beside Donald Trump with a smile and a folder of sealed documents. Her body language was textbook control, hands folded over a leather notepad, jaw tight, eyes steady. For millions watching at home, she was the face of law and order, someone who had made a career defending systems she insisted were merely misunderstood. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, unflinching, dressed in deep navy, her blazer cutting a silhouette as defiant as her record. Her curls were pinned back. Her eyes, sharp, alert, scanned every flicker of movement. Beneath her blazer, a glint, a small silver USB drive, barely noticeable, but enough to catch one camera's eye for just a second. It was gone as fast as it appeared, like the first flash of a storm on a summer night. Larry's voice dropped half a pitch. Tonight, we are here to ask one simple question. When the law protects the enforcers instead of the people, what does justice become? The audience didn't clap. They weren't sure if they were allowed. The gravity was too thick, like lead in the air. In the control room, a producer whispered, "This is going to explode." And Jasmine knew it too. She could feel the eyes, not just the ones in the room, but those of every survivor whose stories were redacted, buried, erased. The weight of their silence sat in her chest like stone, but not for long. She shifted in her seat, just slightly, but the movement felt like a drumbeat. Bondi noticed. Her eyes flicked down. "Let the games begin," she muttered under her breath, lips barely moving. Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. She didn't need to. Because when you have the truth, you don't open with it. You let them lie first. You let the mask hold until the moment it cracks. And just like that, the silence cracked. Pam Bondi leaned forward, voice polished, posture commanding, ready to seize the narrative before Jasmine ever said a word. "During my tenure," she began, her voice ringing with courtroom clarity, "Florida led the nation in law enforcement transparency. Any accusation of data suppression is not only unfounded, it's reckless." There was no pause, no flicker of doubt. She delivered the line like a verdict, not an argument. In that moment, she wasn't just a former attorney general. She was a seasoned tactician reclaiming ground before a single challenge could be launched. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had stood behind podiums, flanked by flags, who knew the cadence that stirred patriotic instincts and dulled scrutiny. The audience heard confidence, some heard authority, but Jasmine Crockett heard calculation. Bondi's gaze swept over the studio as if scanning for approval, then snapped sharply, almost imperceptibly, toward Jasmine. Her eyes narrowed just enough. "This so-called justice audit," she said, the phrase dipped in contempt, "isn't about reform. It's a campaign to shame and dismantle those who risk their lives for this country." She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't even look angry. In fact, that was what made it land harder. It was delivered with the chilly conviction of someone who had no doubt they were right, and who had already decided their opponent wasn't just wrong, but dangerous. The words stung not because they were loud, but because they came wrapped in institutional respectability. To the untrained ear, Bondi sounded like she was defending public servants. But to anyone who had lived beneath the boot of systemic injustice, the subtext was deafening. "How dare you question the machine?" A measured round of applause followed. Light but intentional. The kind that says, "We hear you, we agree, we approve." Some in the audience nodded, others gave knowing looks to the cameras. It was the applause of people who still believed that a clean report meant a clean conscience, of those who trusted that if something didn't show up in the records, it never really happened. And Pam Bondi knew exactly how to speak to them. She'd mastered the tone of sober pragmatism. Just enough empathy to disarm, just enough righteousness to dominate. Her hands rested lightly on her notepad, the corners of her mouth pulled tight into something between composure and command. She sat like a judge in her own courtroom, issuing warnings disguised as facts. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. No eye roll, no quick reply, no raised brow, just a single controlled nod. But behind the stillness was a storm, unspoken, electric. She had heard this song before, It was the same melody that echoed through courtrooms where victims were turned into suspects, where erased body cam footage became policy, and where silence wasn't just survival, it was strategy. Jasmine understood the choreography. Let the accuser take the floor. Let them bask in the sound of their own certainty. Let them tighten the noose with their own rope. Bondi had drawn first blood, but Jasmine hadn't even unsheathed her blade. That restraint wasn't weakness, it was warfare. A stillness born from years of being talked over, underestimated, misjudged. She didn't just come prepared, she came loaded. But now wasn't the time. The camera caught the flicker of a silver USB again, for just a second. The crowd didn't notice. But Bondi did, and her fingers curled slightly on the table. In that precise instant, the power dynamic on set appeared to tilt. Bondi had set the tone, commanded the space, and shaped the early perception. For viewers at home, especially those who still saw Jasmine Crockett through the distorted lens of partisanship or race, the scales momentarily leaned in Bondi's favor. She was composed, confident, seemingly in control. And Jasmine? Still quiet, still calculating. But the game had only just begun, and Jasmine didn't come to play by their rules. She came to break the frame, not with volume, with evidence, with truth. And truth doesn't clap, it crashes, but silence has a way of shifting power. And in the echo of Bondi's applause, Jasmine finally moved, but silence has a way of shifting power. And in the echo of Bondi's applause, Jasmine finally moved. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't clear her throat. She simply leaned forward by an inch, just enough for the light to hit her eyes. And then, in a voice calm as still water, she asked, "Can you guarantee that during your entire tenure, not a single record of police violence was ever removed from the state's data systems?" The words weren't accusatory. They didn't come with heat, but they carried something more dangerous, precision. It was the kind of question that didn't invite argument. It demanded accountability. And in that moment, it was clear Jasmine wasn't trying to win the room. She was trying to check the foundation it was built on. She didn't ask it to provoke. She asked it because she already knew the answer. Pam Bondi responded almost instantly. There was no hesitation, no flicker of surprise. She was ready for this, or thought she was. "I don't just guarantee it," she said, her voice even, her smile unwavering. "I'm proud of it." The response was quick, crisp, and delivered like a polished stone. No cracks, no uncertainty, just confidence. But there was something underneath, a glint of overconfidence, of someone who had said this line too many times in rooms where no one pushed back. And tonight, she had said it to the wrong woman. Bondi's smile was meant to signal strength, but it revealed something else, detachment. As if the thousands of names, the cases buried in silence, were merely entries on a spreadsheet. She wasn't speaking to the victims. She was speaking to the narrative she'd written, and she expected everyone else to follow it. The camera, almost sentient in its timing, cut to Jasmine. She didn't speak. Not yet. The silence stretched, 3 seconds, no more, but enough for everyone in the room to feel it. She didn't blink. Her eyes didn't shift. They stayed locked on Bondi's, unflinching, almost surgical in their stillness. Her expression held no anger, no triumph, just control. Jasmine Crockett wasn't reacting. She was measuring. And after those 3 seconds, she moved her hand slowly to the manila folder in front of her. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, like someone unlocking a door rather than kicking it down. She opened the folder quietly, letting the flap fall back onto the desk. There was no rush, because this wasn't theater for her. This was evidence, and evidence doesn't shout, it waits. Nothing came out of the folder yet. No documents, no charts. Just that one calculated movement. But in the room, everything changed. It was like a shift in gravity. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. The kind of shift that makes people lean forward in their seats without realizing. The kind that slows breath. The kind that tells the body before the brain, something's about to happen. Bondi didn't move, but her smile lost a degree of sharpness. Her hand, still resting on the leather notepad, tensed slightly. The illusion of control was still intact, but it was thinner now, more fragile, Because the moment Jasmine opened that folder, Bondi stopped commanding the room. She started defending it. Jasmine gave a single nod. Not to Bondi, not to the cameras, to herself. A quiet confirmation, as if to say, now we begin. And yet she still didn't speak. She didn't need to, because anyone paying attention, anyone who'd ever been in a room where power masqueraded as truth, could feel it. The balance had shifted, not loudly, not yet, but irrevocably. What Bondi had mistaken for silence was in fact restraint, and what the audience had seen as composure was in fact Jasmine sharpening the blade, word by word, breath by breath. The applause had faded. The momentum Bondi built with her polished answers was already sliding. Viewers across the country wouldn't know why yet, but they'd feel it. Something had cracked. They just hadn't seen it fall. That nod was her signal, not to escalate, but to unveil. And what Jasmine placed on the table next wasn't just paper. It was a loaded weapon made of truth. That nod was her signal, not to escalate, but to unveil. And what Jasmine placed on the table next wasn't just paper. It was a loaded weapon made of truth. With calm, deliberate motion, she reached into the folder, her fingertips moving past prepared notes and reference charts until they found the one document she had known, deep down, would matter more than anything spoken tonight. It was 5 pages long, neatly clipped, folded once down the center. She removed it gently, like a relic from evidence storage, and laid it down with a composure that disguised the emotional weight it carried. She didn't slam it. She didn't thrust it. She simply rotated it, slowly, deliberately, so the cameras could read it clearly. The title, bold and cold at the top of the first page, captured the entire room. Police Data Integrity, Internal Redaction Directive. No spin, no commentary. Just the truth, printed in black ink on neutral government stationery. The air in the studio thinned. There was no voiceover, no cue from the host. The cameras adjusted themselves, as if understanding the gravity without needing instruction. Slowly, one lens closed in, framing the title, the formatting, and finally the last line of the final page. It was a short paragraph, maybe 3 lines. Beneath it, a signature, Pamela Jo Bondi. Above it, the date, August 2020. Not scrawled, not penciled, a full, clear, legal signature in blue ink. The kind of signature you only give when you know what you're authorizing and you're willing to put your name on it. The kind of signature that doesn't just acknowledge policy, it owns it. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands folded calmly in her lap as the evidence took on a life of its own under the lights. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was discipline. To anyone unfamiliar with legal nuance, the language in the document might have seemed mundane, technical, bureaucratic, forgettable. But for Jasmine and for those who had lived what that policy erased, the language was chilling. Terms like incident sensitivity override and optional retention discretion weren't innocent. They were loopholes. They were weapons masked as procedures. They were the reason families searching for justice hit brick walls where records should have been. This document wasn't a policy. It was a permission slip for silence, and Jasmine had just made it visible to the entire country. Pam Bondi didn't speak. For a moment, even she seemed caught in the standoff between her signature and the blinking red light of the live broadcast. Her face remained fixed, but her eyes gave her away. They shifted, first to the document, then to Jasmine, then back again. The briefest flicker. Just enough. The kind of glance that in courtrooms signals a shift in strategy. The kind that confirms recognition. She knew the document, knew it well, but she hadn't expected it here. Not like this, not this early, and not this publicly. The control she had wrapped herself in from the start of the show suddenly felt thinner, looser, less like armor, more like theater lighting. Jasmine leaned back slowly, giving the camera one more uninterrupted view of the signature. She didn't point to it, didn't gloat. She simply let the audience take it in, because she wasn't playing for applause. She was playing for clarity. Her entire career, every hearing, every headline, every confrontation where she was called too loud, too angry, too disruptive, had led to this moment. And what sat between her and Bondi wasn't an accusation, it was a receipt signed and dated by the very woman now trying to disown it. Still, Jasmine didn't speak, because sometimes the truth doesn't need help. Sometimes you just have to put it in the light and let it breathe. For a few long seconds, all that stood between Bondi and the truth was a signature, and now even that began to tremble under the weight of exposure. For a few long seconds, all that stood between Bondi and the truth was a signature, and now even that began to tremble under the weight of exposure. The document sat on the table like a ticking bomb, its pages perfectly still, but radiating consequence. Bondi's eyes hovered over her own name at the bottom of the 5th page, the dated signature in crisp blue ink that no one in the room could deny. Her spine straightened slightly, but not out of pride. It was the reflex of someone preparing for impact. There was no teleprompter to save her here, no legal team to intercept. Only lights, cameras, and the deafening presence of a truth she hadn't expected to face. Not tonight, not from her. She cleared her throat, a faint sound that didn't quite carry, then leaned forward as if proximity to the paper would give her power over it. Her lips parted and the practiced tone returned, but this time thinner. "Draft," she said slowly, "never enacted, no authority." The words were delivered like a defense, but they landed like a retreat. Her voice was lower, not out of humility, but strategy. She was trying to reframe the narrative, to recast the document as irrelevant without denying its existence. She couldn't claim it was fake. She couldn't erase what the cameras had already shown. So she pivoted to ambiguity, to the safety of procedural fog. But ambiguity is not armor. And in a room trained on accountability, it sounded less like explanation and more like evasion. The audience didn't react, not audibly, but the shift in the room was immediate and visceral. Trust doesn't evaporate in screams. It dissolves in silence. You could feel it, subtle, creeping, like a draft through a sealed chamber. Bondi's words didn't just fail to convince. They exposed the desperation beneath her poise. She glanced up, expecting Jasmine to pounce, to counter, to argue. But Jasmine did none of that. She remained still, her face unreadable, her body language composed. It wasn't passive, it was methodical. Because Jasmine Crockett had spent her entire life watching people with power talk their way around pain. And she'd learned that the most effective dismantling often begins with restraint. Then she leaned forward, only slightly, but with a weight that felt seismic. Her eyes didn't shift, her voice didn't rise, but her presence narrowed like a lens locking into focus. And she asked, "Are you sure?" 3 words, quiet, precise, and devastating. There was no need for volume, no flair. The power was in the control, in the restraint, in the absolute clarity that she already knew the answer. Jasmine wasn't just questioning a claim, she was offering Bondi a final out before the collapse, a chance to correct the record, to admit complicity, to salvage a shred of credibility before what came next. But it wasn't just a question for Bondi. It was for every viewer who'd ever wondered why no one was ever held responsible. It was for every family that asked for a report and received a redacted page. It was for the system that hid behind procedure while calling it justice. "Are you sure?" was a challenge, not to power, but to conscience. And as it echoed through the studio, one thing became unmistakably clear. The reckoning was no longer hypothetical. It had already begun. Jasmine didn't blink at the denial, because what came next wasn't a rebuttal. It was revelation, and it was about to hit like a thunderclap. Jasmine didn't blink at the denial, because what came next wasn't a rebuttal. It was revelation, and it was about to hit like a thunderclap. She didn't raise her voice or shift in her seat. Instead, she gave a simple, almost imperceptible nod to the sound technician at the edge of the set. No drama, no need for buildup, just a signal. And within seconds, the studio speakers crackled, and a recording began to play, its clarity so sharp it cut through the air like glass. At first, the room didn't react. Then they heard it. "If we scrub the files, there's nothing left for the grand jury to convict on. Saves us from a few messy civil suits, too." It was Pam Bondi's voice, Not impersonated, not edited, real, and unmistakable. The tone was conversational, even casual, chillingly so. She could have been discussing what to order for lunch, but she was talking about erasing evidence. Evidence that could have changed lives, or ended careers, or brought justice. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. The words hadn't even finished echoing before jaws dropped. Audience members leaned forward, some gripping their armrests without realizing. The voice of a woman who just moments ago had declared herself a champion of law and order was now calmly outlining how to keep the law from touching the people meant to enforce it. But the tape didn't stop. Not yet. A second voice came in, quieter, hesitant. A man, likely a staffer. What about pushback from the press? A pause. Then the answer that detonated what was left of Bondi's credibility. They'll have nothing if there's no record. Delivered like a fact, not a threat. As cold as it was clear. It wasn't just dishonest, it was strategic, premeditated, and now public. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was involuntary, a vacuum. People didn't know whether to gasp or hold their breath, so most did both. The cameras, as if moved by instinct, zoomed in on Bondi's face, and for the first time all night, she didn't know where to look. Her eyes darted, not frantically but subtly, betraying the calculation happening behind them. Her jaw tightened. Her chest rose a little faster than before. Her hands, once folded so neatly in authority, now pressed flat against the table, fingers twitching faintly. It wasn't panic. Not yet. But it was the prelude to collapse. She was staring at the sound of her own voice, undoing years of narrative, and the world was watching it happen live. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The most devastating truths require no amplification. Her stillness was louder than outrage. The recording had done the work. It had taken every thread of plausible deniability Bondi had woven for herself and yanked it out in 10 seconds flat. Jasmine had waited patiently for the lie. She had let Bondi commit to it, on record, on camera. And now she had struck, not with accusation, but with proof. Her strategy had been flawless. Not a trap, but a mirror. And Bondi had walked straight into it, armed only with her arrogance and the assumption that no one would ever dare challenge her that directly. Around the studio, the shift was immediate. The control room lit up in motion, producers frantically whispering, cue lights blinking, camera angles adjusting, but the audience remained frozen in place, stunned not by volume, but by precision. Then slowly, a low murmur rose. Not outrage, realization. A collective reckoning spreading like smoke across the room. Phones lit up like fireflies. Screens opened, notifications buzzed. In seconds, people were already recording, sharing, searching, and across the digital world, one phrase began to surface. First as a whisper, then a roar. Pam caught lying. Not a headline, a verdict. And it wasn't issued by a court. It was issued by everyone. In that moment, Bondi no longer controlled the space. The applause from earlier was a memory now. Distant, meaningless. Her voice, once the anchor of authority in the room, had become its undoing. She wasn't just contradicted. She was exposed. And the damage wasn't theoretical. It was irreversible. Jasmine, composed and quiet, sat like a conductor who had just cued a symphony of reckoning. She had spoken less, but revealed more. And now the country wasn't just watching, it was awakening. The room was cracking under the weight of truth. But Bondi, cornered and unraveling, did what power often does when exposed. She lashed out. The room was cracking under the weight of truth. But Bondi, cornered and unraveling, did what power often does when exposed. She lashed out. She pushed back from the table with a sudden burst of energy, her chair scraping sharply against the polished studio floor, the sound slicing through the silence like a gunshot. Her voice came harder now, stripped of poise, tinged with fury. "That recording is doctored," she snapped, gesturing toward the speakers like they'd committed treason. "It's been cut, manipulated. I demand this broadcast be stopped immediately." Her tone, once calculated and measured, now cracked with desperation. She turned to the host, to the producer, to the camera, anywhere she might still find control. But the control was gone. Her words hit the air without landing. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was reacting, flailing. "I will sue Congresswoman Crockett for releasing internal government material without authorization," she continued, voice rising with each word. "This is a violation of federal law. It's a political ambush, and it's illegal." But no one responded. Not the host, not the crew, not the crowd. The live feed kept rolling. The silence that met her outburst was worse than rebuttal. It was rejection. She was fighting ghosts now, chasing authority in a room that had already moved past her. The audience watched, not in awe, but in calculation, because they'd just heard her admit what she now claimed had been twisted. The contradiction wasn't subtle, it was seismic. Her body language betrayed what her words could no longer cover. Shoulders tight, jaw clenched, hands gesturing wildly without a script to ground them. She wasn't defending herself. She was collapsing in real time, on live television, beneath the weight of her own voice. She called it fake, but the viewers had heard it. She called it illegal, but the truth didn't flinch. And across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat still, as if watching the final act of a drama she'd long since seen coming. Because power, when exposed without preparation, doesn't fade with grace. It claws. It accuses. It demands silence from the very stage where it once demanded applause. And tonight, that silence belonged to someone else. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and chaotic. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply lifted her head and the temperature of the room shifted again. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and chaotic. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply lifted her head and the temperature of the room shifted again. There was no urgency in her movements, no need to shout over the noise Bondi had stirred. Jasmine's calm was not silence. It was control. Her hands rose from her lap and rested firmly on the edge of the table. Fingers splayed, grounded like a judge steadying herself before delivering a verdict. She looked at Bondi, not with contempt, not even with anger, but with a clarity that came from knowing the truth had already spoken. Her voice, when it came, was unwavering. "The original file has been verified and archived with the Library of Congress," she said, the words landing one by one like quiet gavel strikes. "Its digital signature confirms chain of custody and authenticity. Would you like it played in full?" There was no threat in her tone, no bravado, just the brutal stillness of certainty. Bondi didn't answer immediately. She didn't blink. For a moment she seemed suspended, caught between two instincts, deny again or retreat. Her lips parted, but no words came. Across the room the audience had grown still again, but it was a different kind of stillness now. Not cautious, but charged. And then, from the back of the room, a single voice broke through the tension. "Show it!" A second followed, then another, and another. Within moments the entire room was chanting, louder with each beat. "Show the truth! Show the truth!" The rhythm wasn't wild or chaotic. It was focused, precise. It wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about accountability. The demand was clear, and it wasn't going away. In the control room, technicians exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some instinctively reached for buttons, unsure whether to cut the feed or let it roll. But no one moved to stop it, because the momentum now had nothing to do with ratings or airtime. It had to do with something more powerful. A room that had collectively decided it would no longer accept being lied to. The chant echoed not just through the studio, but out through every broadcast signal, every screen, every home where viewers had been told for years that power always wins. And now, for the first time in this story, they could see it cornered. Bondi stood motionless. Her shoulders, once squared with practiced strength, had slumped by a fraction. Her jaw clenched. Her gaze flickered. Toward the cameras, toward the crowd, toward the document still splayed on the table with her name at the bottom. The argument was over. What remained was reckoning. The evidence was not just factual, it was undeniable. And Jasmine had placed it before her, not like an attack, but like a mirror. "This is what you said. This is what you signed. This is what you tried to bury." The studio didn't belong to Bondi anymore. It belonged to the truth. And Jasmine, still seated, didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Her question, "Would you like it played in full?" still lingered in the air, and it echoed louder than any chant. Because beneath that question was another, unspoken but understood by everyone watching. How much more are you willing to lie? And Bondi, for the first time all night, had no answer. The chant still echoed in the studio air, but Jasmine moved without a word, because she knew that truth, once shown, didn't need to shout. The chant still echoed in the studio air, but Jasmine moved without a word, because she knew that truth, once shown, didn't need to shout. With deliberate calm, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, gleaming silver USB drive. It caught the studio light as she held it between her fingers, not for drama, but as if it were a scalpel meant for precision. She leaned forward, connected the USB to the sleek black laptop before her, and the screen behind them, massive, 8 feet wide, visible to everyone in the room and millions more at home, lit up with a single folder, Redaction Records, Florida DOJ. One click, then another, and suddenly the screen bloomed into a spreadsheet. No animations, no banners, just data. Brutal, raw, undeniable. A massive Excel file filled the display. The title bar read, Law Enforcement Use of Force Complaints, 2015 to 2020. The first column, officer badge numbers, then names, then timestamps, jurisdictions, complaint categories, and finally, columns that stopped the room cold. Redacted equals yes, and deleted equals internal review. Row after row scrolled past automatically as the document slowly revealed its scale. 312 officers, each one tied to at least one substantiated use of force complaint. Most had multiple entries. As Jasmine let the data scroll on its own, a heat began to build in the studio. Not from temperature, but from impact. This was not theory. It was math. It was history buried in spreadsheets. And now it was illuminated for all to see. As the audience leaned forward, the numbers told a story darker than any headline. On the left side of the screen, names that once belonged only to sealed folders or hushed settlements were suddenly public, exposed. On the right, cells turned red, yellow, or gray, conditional formatting designed by Jasmine's team to show how deeply the problem ran. She had done her homework, but the most damning column was the one in plain text. Victim demographics. The screen filtered automatically as Jasmine clicked a drop-down menu. 82% of the victims were Black or Latino. Another filter applied. 67% of the reports tied to these incidents had been marked redacted during Bondi's final 18 months in office, and nearly 40% had no surviving digital file, only paper entries that had been sealed under administrative discretion. The air changed. People were no longer just shocked. They were shaken. One woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man in the third row removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Another clenched his fist without realizing it. This wasn't abstract anymore. These weren't concerns or claims. These were names, dates, counties, codes, and next to each line, somewhere in the cells, was the invisible weight of a family that had likely been told, "We found no misconduct." Jasmine didn't say a word. She just let the screen keep scrolling. Camera 3 zoomed in on Bondi's face. There was no way to misread what was happening now. She stared at the screen, not with defiance, but a kind of frozen, white-knuckled stillness that spoke of a mind spinning too fast to form a strategy. The data was hers, her office, her signature, her silence. And Jasmine had peeled back the curtain without touching her. It was the cleanest dissection of power ever broadcast on live television. The next slide Jasmine opened was a single-page summary. It showed a breakdown: 312 named officers, 254 involved in 2 or more complaints, 198 complaints resulted in no action due to insufficient documentation. In the bottom right corner, a citation, compiled from internal archives, retrieved via FOIA requests, court subpoenas, and independent whistleblower materials. Jasmine turned her head slightly toward the camera, not to address the audience, but to let the moment frame itself. No speech, no monologue, just the facts, projected 10 feet tall behind her. Bondi's name wasn't on this screen, but her fingerprints were on every data point. And then Jasmine did speak. quietly, just loud enough for the microphone to carry. These are not accusations. These are records. Records buried by policy, not by accident, and they don't need me to explain them. She paused. They speak for themselves. Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't impassioned. It was firm. Like a prosecutor stating facts for the jury, because she wasn't trying to convince anyone. She was simply showing them what had been hidden all along. The crowd didn't erupt. It breathed, hard, heavy, unsettled, because this wasn't the catharsis they were used to. It was something worse and truer. A reckoning not built on outrage, but on evidence. For every viewer watching at home, something visceral began to take hold. It wasn't just that the data exposed injustice, it was that it had been there the entire time, and no one had seen it, until Jasmine forced them to. Bondi hadn't spoken in minutes. Her posture had shifted, her shoulders curled inward, her hands no longer confident, but clenched. Her voice, the one that had once filled courtrooms and press conferences, was nowhere to be found. Because the most powerful voice in the room now didn't belong to her, or even to Jasmine. It belonged to the truth, measured in numbers, laid bare in rows and columns, made undeniable by its cold consistency. The data was more damning than any accusation Jasmine could have leveled, and Bondi knew it. One final slide flickered onto the screen. Archived cases, suppressed until now. It listed 6 case numbers, all linked to police departments across Florida, all previously closed without public explanation. Jasmine highlighted one. A line at the bottom read, Victim, Marcus W., age 16. Complaint, excessive force. Outcome, body cam footage deleted. Record marked inconclusive. A collective exhale swept through the room, not from surprise but recognition. For every Marcus W., there were more. And Jasmine had just opened the floodgates. The camera pulled back slowly. The spreadsheet faded to black, but the impact stayed. In every face, every breath, every tear. Jasmine didn't raise her hands in victory. She simply looked across the table, once more, at the woman who had tried to dismiss her, discredit her, and bury her under institutional weight. But Jasmine hadn't pushed back with anger. She had answered with evidence. And the story had changed, not because she demanded it, but because she proved it, in full view of the world. The data had landed like a detonation. But while the room sat in stunned silence, Pam Bondi did the one thing she had left. She ran. The data had landed like a detonation. But while the room sat in stunned silence, Pam Bondi did the one thing she had left. She ran. Without warning, she shoved back her chair with a loud screech and stood up fast enough to jolt the nearest camera. Her hand went to the mic clipped at her collar, fingers trembling as she tore it off and let it drop to the table with a sharp metallic thud. "We're done here," she muttered, eyes darting around, face flushed with the heat of exposure. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked past them, toward the exit, toward escape, as if distance could undo what evidence had already burned into the moment. Her heels clacked against the floor as she turned, one hand gripping the edge of the table for balance, the other fumbling for her phone. Her composure had collapsed. What remained was flight instinct, raw and unfiltered. But she didn't make it far. In the control booth above the set, the director's voice came down through the comms like the voice of God, calm, cold, in absolute command. "Security, keep her in the studio," he said, voice piped directly into the earpieces of stage personnel. "Congresswoman Crockett has the floor, and the broadcast is live." 1 second later, the heavy studio doors clicked shut behind her. Mechanized, automatic, standard protocol for live federal programming. But now it felt cinematic, inevitable. The exit she'd assumed was hers had vanished. One studio guard, a man in a dark suit with a Secret Service earpiece, gently but firmly stepped between her and the door. She looked at him in disbelief, like this couldn't possibly be happening to her. Not her, but the signal was clear. You don't get to leave when you're the one on trial. Bondi turned slowly, like someone stepping back into a room they didn't recognize. Her eyes scanned the space again. Only this time the room wasn't hers. It belonged to the reckoning, to the weight of the facts now seared into the nation's memory. to the silence that wrapped around her not like protection, but like a noose. Her legs stiffened, shoulders hunched. Her once impeccable posture, trained in press conferences, courtrooms, and campaign stages, now faltered under the unbearable pressure of being exposed, cornered, and watched by millions. Jasmine hadn't moved. She remained seated, her presence as centered and steady as it had been from the start. But there was something different now, something in her stillness that radiated even more power. She didn't need volume. She didn't need applause. She had truth, and tonight, that was finally louder than spin. She waited until Bondi had fully turned back toward the stage. Then, slowly, methodically, Jasmine lifted her chin and spoke, voice smooth as a blade. Would you like to apologize first, or should my legal advisor walk the room through the 5 federal charges you may be facing? She didn't blink, didn't raise her tone. She simply let the words hang there, perfectly balanced between invitation and warning. The crowd froze. The line wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. It didn't roar. It sliced. There was no ambiguity in her voice, no guesswork, just certainty that somewhere behind the legal jargon and institutional ritual, consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real, and they had found their target. Jasmine kept her gaze locked, letting the silence do what most arguments never could. Force self-reflection. She didn't want blood. She wanted accountability, but she wasn't about to beg for it. She was offering Bondi the dignity of a choice, confess or be condemned, in front of everyone, in front of the country. The audience leaned forward, some instinctively holding their breath. It felt like a scene from a courtroom drama, except it wasn't fiction. It was live, raw, irrevocable. Bondi stood there silent, her lips parting as if to respond, but nothing came. Not denial, not defiance, just stillness. Her face, once a mask of media-trained composure, had cracked into something too human to hide. Fear, not of Jasmine, not even of public opinion, but of the system she'd believed she could always control, finally saying no more. In that moment, everything inverted. The powerful was now the questioned, the accused, and Jasmine Crockett, once called an amateur, dismissed, underestimated, had not only held her ground. She had claimed the truth, and she had done it without raising her voice. The only thing louder than the silence now was the weight of every uncovered lie collapsing under its own gravity. And the country watched, riveted, as one woman refused to run and the other was forced to stop. Pam Bondi, for the first time that night, did not speak, because anything she said now would only echo in the shadow of the evidence Jasmine had already laid bare. She left the studio in silence, but the world outside was already wide awake, and it had no intention of letting her walk away untouched. She left the studio in silence, but the world outside was already wide awake, and it had no intention of letting her walk away untouched. By dawn, the political machine had shifted into overdrive. Headlines screamed across devices before coffee had even brewed. Bombshell broadcast, Pam Bondi exposed on live television, lit up CNN's morning crawl. At 6:03 a.m., the House Judiciary Committee released a one-page official notice. Pamela Jo Bondi is hereby subpoenaed to appear for sworn testimony under Section 234.2 of the Congressional Oversight Protocol. The seal of Congress sat like a knife at the top. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. The time of public image management was over. Now came the law. By 9:15 a.m., Department of Justice spokespeople confirmed what was already inevitable. A formal federal inquiry had been opened into allegations of destruction of public records, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to conceal misconduct by law enforcement personnel. The language was dry, but the meaning was volcanic. Bondi's office, once hailed as a fortress of order and institutional pride, was now being dissected by teams of investigators armed with subpoenas and sealed warrants. The phrase pattern and practice returned to the national lexicon with the weight of an indictment. And behind closed doors in Washington, names that hadn't made Jasmine's spreadsheet were being whispered with increasing urgency. This wasn't just about Florida anymore. This was a contagion of accountability. The media followed like bloodhounds. For 72 hours, it was inescapable. Fox News tried to cast it as a partisan ambush, But even their analysts flinched when the raw footage aired again. Unedited, unforgiving, impossible to spin. MSNBC framed it as the turning point for federal police reform, with panelists nearly shouting over each other about constitutional implications. CNN ran back-to-back specials with expert forensic analysts confirming the authenticity of the leaked directive and the voice recordings. Every network had different angles, but one truth was consistent. Pam Bondi had been caught lying. And she hadn't just lied to the public, she'd lied under oath. She'd lied with a signature. Financial markets responded like they always do when power cracks. By noon, Wall Street felt it. Shares in public liability insurance firms, particularly those with major police union contracts, dropped nearly 6.3%. It was quiet at first, just a flicker. But then the algorithms kicked in. Headlines about redacted records and erased camera footage began being cross-referenced with litigation risk. Investment firms began quietly reviewing exposure reports tied to police misconduct settlements. Boardrooms that had never cared about a congressional hearing were now fielding calls from risk management. What else is buried? Who else signed off? For them, it was no longer about justice. It was about survival. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the ripple effect went national. 7 other states received urgent requests from congressional oversight subcommittees to submit full audits of police complaint records dating back to 2015, particularly redactions conducted under administrative authority. State attorneys general in Georgia, Texas, and Arizona were suddenly facing press inquiries they had no prepared answers for. The same playbook Bondi had used, vague memos, internal reviews, selective transparency, was now a smoking blueprint. And Jasmine Crockett, whether she intended it or not, had become a symbol not just of opposition, but of consequence. Not because she shouted, but because she proved it, on live television, with facts no one could erase. In just one night, the mythology of invincibility that had surrounded Bondi, one built over years of court appearances, political endorsements, and calculated public relations, had shattered. Her name was no longer mentioned as a candidate for higher office. It was now listed next to terms like federal investigation, criminal referral, and possible indictment. She hadn't just lost a debate, she had triggered a reckoning, and the system that once insulated her was now preparing to question her under oath, with cameras rolling and witnesses lined up. By sunset, a different kind of silence settled across Washington. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence before escalation, the kind that lives in hearing rooms, in grand jury chambers, in the nervous spaces where lawyers stop talking and start listening. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just asked the right questions, she had forced the country to ask its own. And no one, not Bondi, not her allies, not the agencies who'd enabled her, could avoid the answer anymore. Because the truth, once spoken, doesn't shrink. It expands, and now it was in motion, tearing down the walls that once held it back. The echo of truth hadn't even begun to fade, but by morning the reckoning had already left the studio and walked straight into the halls of American power. The echo of truth hadn't even begun to fade, but by morning the reckoning had already left the studio and walked straight into the halls of American power. Headlines weren't just reacting now, they were aligning, shifting, anchoring themselves to one story, one confrontation, one name. Jasmine Crockett's expose had pierced through political noise and institutional fog like sunlight through glass. And as the news cycle evolved from reaction to fallout, the implications started pulling threads long buried under red tape and silence. At 7:15 a.m., while early commuters poured into Capitol Hill and corporate America clutched lattes with distracted indifference, Pam Bondi released a carefully worded statement through her legal representative. Effective immediately, I will be stepping back from the practice of law to focus on defending my name and preserving my legacy. The words fell like a closing door. They rang hollow, polished but defensive, drenched in the same clinical detachment that had defined her televised unraveling. She wasn't apologizing. She was insulating, resigning without resignation, retreating from the front lines while pretending it was strategy. But no one mistook it for grace. Not anymore. The country had heard her voice on tape, and it didn't care how her PR team wanted to frame it. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett wasn't relishing the fallout. She was rewriting the script. For years, she'd fought to be heard in rooms that refused to see her, courtrooms, committees, press panels where her credibility was questioned before she ever opened her mouth. But today, she stood at a marble podium in the Rayburn House office building with a folder in her hand and a pen clipped neatly into its spine. In her voice was no bitterness, no vengeance, only purpose. Inside the folder was a 37-page legislative proposal titled the National Police Record Transparency Act. It was simple in its demands but seismic in its impact. All 50 states would be federally required to digitize, declassify, and publish law enforcement misconduct data, including use of force complaints, redacted internal investigations, and all disciplinary action within a 10-year look-back window. Non-compliance would trigger the immediate withholding of federal law enforcement grants. No discretion, no delay. Transparency was no longer a choice. Standing beside her were co-sponsors, Democrats and even a few stunned Republicans who understood what had shifted. They weren't riding her momentum. They were being pulled into its orbit. Jasmine didn't speak like a politician that morning. She spoke like a woman carrying a generation's worth of withheld grief and structural betrayal, and finally, placing it on record. "I'm not here to dismantle law enforcement," she said to the room filled with live microphones and national reporters. "I'm here to remove the shield that's been used to protect injustice under its name. The badge should be a symbol of service, not secrecy." Her voice, though even, had the weight of a hammer. "This isn't about left or right. This is about right or wrong. And we are decades late." She looked directly at the press gallery, letting that sentence hang like a sentence all its own. No more buried files. No more families asking for justice and being handed a redacted PDF. Her words rippled across the room like static before a storm. Not a sound followed her speech, just scribbling pens, flashing cameras, and one shared realization among the reporters present. They were no longer covering a response to scandal. They were watching the birth of a federal reform movement that had just found its sharpest spear. That afternoon, Jasmine walked the long corridor that stretched from the rotunda to the East Senate steps. Her team flanked her, but behind them, dozens of everyday people gathered quietly, not protesting, not chanting, but simply standing, watching. Many had arrived without signs, without microphones. They carried only their stories of lost brothers, of buried reports, of taped-over body cam footage in quiet settlements. Some carried manila folders, some carried memories, and all of them watched Jasmine with something more powerful than approval. They watched with belief. As she stepped down the marble steps toward the bright spring air, a small crowd began to gather closer, forming a quiet corridor. Hands clapped, not raucously, but deliberately, as if each palm strike was an exhale of years spent being ignored. Jasmine didn't wave. She didn't pause for selfies. She simply kept walking. Her navy blue blazer caught the sunlight, and her heels echoed softly against the stone. But the sound wasn't lonely. It was ceremonial. Halfway down the steps, a reporter from the Washington Post broke through the cordon of silence. His voice wasn't accusatory. It was curious, honest. "Congresswoman, aren't you afraid of blowback, of retaliation from the system?" Jasmine stopped mid-step. She didn't turn right away. She let the question sit, like every question she'd once been asked that was never about her competence, but her place. Then she turned slowly. Her eyes met his. There was no condescension, no anger, only steel. "I'm not afraid of the truth," she said, her voice firm but intimate, as if she were speaking directly to every bystander watching from behind their screens. "I'm afraid we've been quiet for too long." The line didn't hit like a soundbite. It landed like a reckoning. People didn't cheer. They exhaled. Some nodded. Some cried. A few clapped again, slower this time, because that sentence wasn't for applause. It was a mirror, and everyone who heard it had to ask themselves what side of that silence they'd stood on. The cameras found her again, not because they were instructed to, but because they had no other choice. She was no longer just part of the story. She was its spine. The lens zoomed slowly, focusing on her face, tired, unwavering, lit from one side by the sun and from the other by the weight of everything she carried. Her breath was steady, her mouth closed, and in her eyes was something unshakable. Not pride, but promise. The screen faded to black. A final chord of music, low and pulsing, rose in the background. Not like a victory theme, but like the sound of something that cannot be stopped. Justice wasn't finished, but it had been awakened, and now it had a name. Jasmine Crockett. The camera faded to black, but what lingered wasn't applause or scandal. It was the echo of something deeper, something human. A reckoning not just with power, but with ourselves. The camera faded to black, but what lingered wasn't applause or scandal. It was the echo of something deeper, something human. A reckoning not just with power, but with ourselves. Because beneath every headline, every data point, and every drop mic was a lesson we'd ignored too long. We have built systems to maintain order, yet we've let those same systems shield injustice, as long as it wore a uniform or smiled for the press. Jasmine Crockett didn't expose a villain. She exposed our comfort with silence. She showed us that the greatest threat to democracy isn't corruption, it's indifference. It's what happens when a lie is easier to digest than the truth, and when power is allowed to define reality unchallenged. And for too long, we've accepted redacted truths, believing that sealed records and missing footage were just procedural quirks. But when justice depends on who holds the pen or the power to erase, it isn't justice, it's theater, and the curtain had to fall. The lesson Jasmine left us wasn't about Bondi. It wasn't about Florida. It was about every room where a victim sat across from a system designed to exhaust them into surrender. It was about every mother who knocked on doors only to be told her son's death was a closed file. It was about the weight of truth buried under policies that no one reads and silence that everyone feels. Jasmine taught us that evidence is not power until someone dares to lift it into the light, and more importantly, until someone refuses to look away. She didn't come with vengeance. She came with proof. And in doing so, she reminded us that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through a spreadsheet. Sometimes it stands calmly across from authority and says, "Are you sure?" And in that moment, the world tilts. This was never about one courtroom or one lawmaker. The human lesson was always about us. We watched a woman who had been underestimated, interrupted, and discredited stand up without theatrics and change the narrative with composure, clarity, and facts. Jasmine didn't ask for validation. She didn't demand loyalty. She asked a harder question. Will you choose to see what you've been trained to overlook? And that question is still being asked. Every time a report is sealed, every time a badge is protected at the cost of a life, every time we scroll past injustice because we're too tired to care. She made us see that silence has always had accomplices. And in doing so, she left us with a choice, complicity or confrontation. And no one gets to stand in the middle. What Jasmine did wasn't flashy, it was forensic. She didn't destroy her opponent. She let the truth do that. She showed us that facts don't need applause, they need daylight. And that sometimes justice doesn't roar. It arrives slowly, relentlessly, on the back of every person who refused to be erased. She taught us that the arc of justice isn't automatic. It is moved inch by people willing to risk everything just to hold the system accountable to the promises it makes. She reminded us that what's legal isn't always what's right, and what's right almost never comes easy, but it is always, always worth the fight. And so, the real lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind is this. When truth is buried beneath bureaucracy, when power rewrites the past to control the future, when justice becomes a luxury instead of a right, it takes more than a voice to change it. It takes evidence, it takes endurance, and it takes someone who refuses to leave the room until the silence is broken. That someone was Jasmine. And now the question she passed to the rest of us is dangerously simple. Who's next? Because the truth is still here, waiting, and it won't speak for itself. Someone must stand. Someone must ask. Someone must refuse to be quiet. Fade out. Final frame. The system may silence people, but it cannot silence proof. Music builds. Not to a climax, but to a warning. And then, silence. The truth had been exposed, the silence shattered. But Jasmine Crockett's story wasn't just a warning. It was a call. And now that call belongs to us. The truth had been exposed, the silence shattered. But Jasmine Crockett's story wasn't just a warning. It was a call. And now that call belongs to us. Because nothing she did, no document, no revelation, no devastating line of questioning, means anything if we go back to scrolling, forgetting, or believing this was just another headline in a country numb to justice delayed. The evidence has been shown. The patterns have been proven. The system has been caught this time. But if we let it close ranks again, if we allow it to sweep the next file under the rug or redact the next name from history, then we are not just bystanders. We are accomplices. We do not need more proof. We need more pressure. On every legislature, every courtroom, every agency that answers to no one unless we make them. We must act, not tomorrow, not when it's convenient, not when a tragedy trends, but now, while the fire is still burning. Demand your state representatives pass the transparency laws Jasmine proposed. Demand open archives, independent reviews, and the right to see the truth, not through leaks, but through law. Sign petitions, flood inboxes. Don't let them kill bills with procedural silence. Show up to local hearings. Ask who decides what gets sealed and why. If you work inside the system and you've seen the darkness firsthand, come forward. Blow the whistle. Bring receipts. You are not alone. You are not powerless. You are the reason this movement cannot be silenced. But most of all, remember this. No change ever begins with the system deciding to fix itself. It begins with pressure, with exposure, with confrontation. And that confrontation doesn't require a title. It doesn't require a camera. It requires courage. You don't have to be Jasmine Crockett to make an impact. You just have to refuse to let power define the truth. When someone tells you, "It's always been done this way," ask why. When someone tries to shut down your questions, ask louder. When a victim becomes a statistic, turn their name into a movement. And when someone tries to bury the truth again, don't wait for permission. Dig. Because the fight Jasmine started doesn't end in a courtroom. It ends when justice no longer hides in shadows, when every voice matters and every life counts, not just the ones deemed clean or convenient enough to remember. If you're reading this, watching this, feeling this, you are part of the resistance. You are the next witness, the next record keeper, the next wall they cannot erase. Don't let this story fade. Don't let this moment pass. Turn this testimony into action, and never ever be silent again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.